I'm Susan Bocamazo from Lawyers Weekly, and I'm here today with Laurie Bishop, who's a partner at Hirsch Weinstein and also general counsel at Berklee College of Music. Laurie's practice includes advising colleges and universities on their policies and procedures and aiding them in various risk management decisions. And so at this time, it seemed like a really good opportunity to sit down and talk to Laurie about the issues that are facing institutions of higher education. Good afternoon, Laurie.
Thanks, Susan. So great to be here with you.
Well, thanks for joining us. So let's get started. What do you think are the biggest COVID-19 related litigation risks for colleges and universities?
Well, there's a lot, probably unsurprisingly. And part of the difficulty of this is the unknown. We don't know exactly what we'll face, and we don't know the likelihood of success of any of the claims that we will face. So one that we know that we'll face and we're already facing is class actions, of course, based on tuition refunds or lack thereof. This is probably the one that people have heard most about. So I think generally, overall, these claims are not terribly likely to succeed, but it's certainly not something any of us want to add to the list of concerns. I still think there is a question mark as to whether and what parts of these may be covered by insurance. That's obviously a huge issue in all of our minds. I think there's also a possibility that there's going to be an uptick on these based on the way refunds were handled in spring as compared to how fall plans look. And if schools end up having to send students home again, God forbid, we'd be facing the same issues. Another big concern is tort liability. It's what happens if someone gets sick, a student or an employee, or if there's an outbreak or a cluster on campus, or if somebody dies because of an infection and they claim that they got it because of being on campus. There's also a host of employment claims, and we're starting to see more and more employment claims that are based on COVID issues and other individual claims by students. So disability discrimination claims and ADA, 504, accommodation issues, and wage and hour issues. There's also kind of a general understanding that whenever people are feeling disenfranchised and are losing or facing loss of employment, which so many people are, there'll be a natural uptick in employment claims.
So you mentioned a number of risks. What can colleges and universities do to try to minimize those?
Right. That's the million-dollar question, I guess the multi-million-dollar question, right? So for class action, some of it may just be really the luck of the draw. I mean, you just get picked by the plaintiff who's bringing these things and you get added to the list. But looking at things that maybe you can try to do to help prevent that, looking closely at your policies and your handbooks and your websites and see exactly what you're promising. These suits all involve contract claims based on things like that. Looking at what you did in the spring when campus shut down, what did you refund or not and why, what was done for any summer term you had, and how all of that factors into your plans for the fall. Is it consistent? It might not be, and that might be for good reason. That shouldn't add any fuel to a spring claim, but having thought about it on the front end will be useful. Another thing to keep in mind is the possibility of another campus shutdown if you are one of the schools that's opening up again. And are you promising now certain refunds? And if so, why? If it's different than what you did before, again, why? And like I said before, there may be very good reasons for it. And they may not be legally significant at the end of the day, but it's certainly worth thinking of now. One note on trying to mitigate this risk, I'm also very mindful that the world is a completely different place now than it was when initial shutdowns happened. So looking at this risk, it shouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction. It shouldn't be, the litigation tail wagging the dog, right? This is going to involve some careful balancing of risk of what we think are not great lawsuits based against the, other institutional considerations that come into play. As for tort liability, schools have to first take all the necessary and hard and expensive measures to reduce the risk on campus as best they can. It's never going to be perfect, but it should at least be in line with public health authority guidance and what other schools are doing. So assuming that base level of exposure mitigation is already occurring, schools should ensure that all community members are completely aware of the risks of exposure and infection and illness, and aware that while the school's taking measures to reduce it, it can't guarantee that there's no risk or that it won't happen. Along with making that clear, schools also need to make expectations and new requirements very clear to everyone. like wearing masks, avoiding gatherings, and staying home when someone's sick. A lot of this can be done through an acknowledgement of risk document that community members must at least acknowledge and perhaps sign off that they did see it and understand it. Some schools are asking students to sign forms like this and more formally assume risk. Others are seeking actual waivers of liability from anyone entering campus. There's kind of a grab bag as to what's happening there. One note on waivers, though, to keep in mind is that employee waivers are likely precluded by law. So be careful if you're considering having your employees sign something like that before coming back. From my thinking, I think an acknowledgement of the risks is maybe the best and the easiest way to go and maybe accepted more easily by your community members. For employment claims, you'll need to make sure that your COVID-related policies are clear and compliant, and be sure that your folks on the ground are administering them and have a good understanding of the differences now. And employment law is a little different now than it was before. So we're all still learning this as we go. So you need to make sure that your HR folks have a good understanding of that too.
So the big thing now that colleges are trying to decide is, are they going to reopen? What's it going to look like when they reopen? Are there other risks that are specifically tied to those issues? Are there questions that colleges are coming to you with now that they're having to, college is supposed to open in about a month, so they got to make a decision. What are you hearing? What are the concerns?
Well, the single biggest risk is, of course, an outbreak on campus or amongst community members. And what do you do if that does occur? You better have thought about it. You better have plans for it. But that, I think, is top of everybody's mind. We've never been through this before. We don't know what might work or what might not work. Everyone is trying very, very hard to make sure we have done everything possible to minimize this, but we just don't know. So going back to how I started this, the biggest risk is the unknown, and not knowing if, despite all of our best efforts, these bad things will still happen. I think the next biggest risk that folks think about is another campus shutdown. Whether that's caused by kind of overall virus spread, or the governor's stay-at-home type orders, or by campus-specific issues. Nobody wants to have to go through that again. And as everybody knows, it's a huge amount of tumult for everyone involved.
So what issues arise from the use of stimulus funding that was received from the CARES Act?
So the biggest challenge with the CARES Act funding has been unclear and changing guidance throughout the process. So first, with the student funds, there were significant questions as to who was or who should be eligible. So schools are trying to get the funds out to students, as we were instructed to do very quickly. And at the same time, the government is determining and reconsidering whether the first guidance should be different. They're being challenged against what they said before. So they're shifting stands at the same time that schools are trying to get it out quickly. Another question related to the government first saying that in order to be eligible, colleges have to agree to the greatest extent practicable to maintain their employees and current contractors. Basically, if you get this money, you're agreeing to try and not fire a lot of people, because the government doesn't want to see a lot of people fired. Nobody knew what that meant, but it's of course kind of a terrifying thing to think when you are faced with needing to furlough and lay off people. And thinking that is maybe somehow tied to these government funds, and how will we know how much is too much? So they later clarified that this was based on the unique, financial circumstances of the institution, but there's still no specifics as to what that means. So I don't know of any school that is not taking necessary actions to furlough and lay off if it feels it has to because of that, yet it's there. And we just don't know how or whether the department will never, bring us to task on that and kind of say there are specific requirements that we never knew about. Similarly for the institutional funds, they were on shifting stands. They say they were flexible. They say, well, we're going to tell you a bit more about them, and they don't seem quite as flexible. So it's still on shifting stands. So I think that most schools are are going forward in good faith and assuming they've done it right, or at least tried their best to get it right, but we just don't know what the department might say later, because they've more recently had this habit of kind of saying one thing and then thinking maybe it's another, and guidance kind of just coming out here and there.
And one last question. What would you describe as the 2 or 3 best practices that colleges and universities should be following in dealing with the current situation?
So I think the first one is that if you are going to open, if you're going to have anyone on campus, is to take all of those measures that I discussed before and how to mitigate tort liability. You need to have eyes wide open to what you need to do, and also understand that those are not cheap things. You know, you can't just hand out face masks and expect the day to be over. You know, you need to get as deep as thinking about, you know, what is the airflow like in this building, you know, that's maybe 200 years old? And do I have to get, you know, special HEPA filters for it? So you have to go so deep in that thinking. And there's so many areas of a college that have to be involved in that to really hit all of the points. It's just, when you get into it, shocking of all the things that you haven't thought about of, you know, gosh, there's a button over here that 8,000 students touch in one day. What do we have to do about that? So I think a lot of colleges are on that bandwagon right now, and they know they've got the entire campus wrapped around trying to make sure that they touch all those points. But I think an overall best practice is that knowing that you're going to have to be ready to pivot on a moment's notice. So the fact that you've spent months planning for one scenario can't get in the way of making the necessary decision to reverse course if that's what's right. So as you're going through and designing your programs, you should design them to be flexible and make sure your operations are nimble enough to change. Because, you know, just the fact that you've worked really hard on it for how long has it been? 3 months, 4 months now, doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way to go. And we're all watching the news every day, and colleges have to be open-minded as to the developments. And I think they're doing that, but it's important to keep in mind as we get closer and closer to students actually showing up on campus.
Well, Laurie, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. This is kind of an evolving situation. So we may be sitting down with you again in the next month or so to see how things kind of played out.
I'd be happy to. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.